Emperor Hirohito. He was Japan's longest-reigning monarch, a man who saw his country through a devastating world war and then a miraculous rebirth. But his entire legacy is caught up in this one massive paradox, this question about the two completely different lives he seemed to lead. I mean, just look at this contrast. On one hand, you've got the pre-1945 Hirohito, a literal god emperor, the supreme commander, and whose name a brutal, continent-spanning war was fought. And on the other, the post-war Hirohito, a quiet marine biologist, a guest of honor at the White House who visited Disneyland. How can these two be the same person? And that really gets to the heart of it all. Was he just a powerless figurehead, a puppet manipulated by a fanatical military? Or was he a culpable warlord, an active leader who knew exactly what was happening and gave his approval? That's the historical mystery we're going to unpack. To even begin to understand this, we have to go all the way back. We need to see how the man and the myth were built, how Japan forged itself a living god. It all boils down to this one incredibly powerful concept, Arahitogami, an incarnate divinity. You see, the Constitution of 1889 didn't just make the emperor a head of state. It legally enshrined him as a living god on earth, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu. This wasn't just a religious belief. It was state policy, the very core of Japanese nationalism. And his own path to power was lightning fast. Born in 1901, he was named heir just over a decade later. By the time he was only 20 years old, he was already effectively ruling as regent for his sick father. Then, in 1926, he officially took the throne, kicking off the Showa era, the period that would change Japan and the world forever. And it's right here in the Showa era that things get complicated. So let's dig into the evidence and see what his actual role was during Japan's massive military expansion. You know, the popular image is of this passive emperor, totally removed from strategy. Well, the reality seems to be the exact opposite. Sources show Hirohito was an active participant in military planning, constantly grilling his generals, especially about his biggest worry, a potential attack from the Soviet Union. And you can just feel the frustration in his own words. This is not some distant monarch. This is a commander-in-chief absolutely ripping into his army chief of staff. He knows the troop numbers, he knows the objective, and he's furious they're failing. And that final question to his top general, "Are you lying to me?" That says everything. And the paper trail, well, it gets darker. He gave the green light for the invasion of Manchuria. He endorsed the cynical policy of calling the war in China an incident, a legal trick that stripped prisoners of war of any protections under international law. And maybe most damning of all, he personally sanctioned the three alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all, a brutal, scorched earth campaign that led to the deaths of millions of Chinese civilians. But if you want one piece of evidence that points to his direct hands-on involvement, it's just a number. 375. What could that possibly mean? That's how many times Hirohito gave his personal sign-off, his imperial sanction for the use of chemical weapons. And this was just during one single campaign, the invasion of Wuhan. These weren't broad policies. We're talking about hundreds of individual orders to deploy poison gas, each one approved by him. Okay, so with all of this evidence, you have to be asking, how on earth did the story change so completely? How did he escape justice? And that brings us to the end of the war, and a huge strategic decision known as the MacArthur pivot. The pressure to prosecute him was absolutely immense. I mean, the entire war had been fought in his name. The Allies and a huge majority, 70%, of the American public all wanted him in the dock on trial as a war criminal. His prosecution seemed like a foregone conclusion. But it never happened. Instead, as the historian John W. Dower put it, a deliberate and unbelievably successful campaign was launched to rewrite the entire story. Hirohito wasn't just let off the hook. His image was completely remade, turning him into an almost saintly figure. So why? Why the massive change of heart? It all came down to a cold, hard political calculation by General Douglas MacArthur. He was convinced that putting the emperor on trial would ignite chaos, maybe even a revolution. For him, keeping Hirohito on the throne was the key to a peaceful occupation and, crucially, to building a stable, anti-communist Japan for the looming Cold War. And just like that, one of the most incredible public relations makeovers in history began.
The god emperor of a military empire was about to be reinvented as the gentle symbol of a brand new, pacifist Japan.
And this change wasn't just for show. It was written into law. The old constitution called him the imperial sovereign, a divine being with total command of the military. The new 1947 constitution, written by the Americans, demoted him to the symbol of the state with absolutely no governmental power. The final step? He had to go on the radio and publicly declare that he was not, in fact, a god. And if you need a single image to capture this complete 180, this is it. In 1975, the man who had authorized the attack on Pearl Harbor was shaking hands with President Ford, touring Disneyland, and buying a Mickey Mouse watch. The warlord had become a grandfatherly tourist. The transformation was complete. But of course, history is never that neat and tidy. MacArthur's pivot may have saved Hirohito from the courtroom, but it couldn't erase the past. And decades after his death in 1989, new evidence keeps surfacing, ensuring his legacy is as fiercely debated as ever. So the two stories live on. On one side, you have the argument that he was just a figurehead, simply too weak to alter the course of events, as one British report put it. But on the other, you have diaries from his own aides discovered long after his death that show a man deeply involved in strategy, who agonized over his own responsibility for the war. Perhaps the most telling words, though, come from the emperor himself. When a journalist asked him about the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, his reply was chillingly ambiguous. He said it was very regrettable, but then added it couldn't be helped because that happened in wartime. It's a statement of regret and resignation, leaving his true feelings a mystery. Which leaves us with this final, massive question. When a leader's power is so wrapped up in being a symbol, a god, where does the man's personal responsibility begin, and where does it end? For Emperor Hirohito, the verdict of history remains as divided as the two lives he led.